All right, Patrick, can you hear us?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it. So thanks for everyone to attend that chose to attend. I want to tell you a little bit about Provenance Consulting, a little bit about me, and then we'll get into the content of the material. First, Provenance Consulting. We are a Trinity Consultants Company. Our primary purpose is to improve the safety of chemical processes of facilities that manage highly hazardous chemicals. That's frequently kind of known as process safety management compliance. A lot of our clients not only are under the regulatory guidelines of PSM, but also have chosen to kind of expand that regulatory requirements to a little bit broader, and we help them make sure that all of their process safety needs are met. We really engineer process safety solutions, and whenever I'm talking to people that are kind of outside of kind of the industrial space, the way that I describe it is we help our clients keep the dangerous stuff in the pipes, and we help them avoid catastrophic accidents. That seems to kind of really resonate with the general public, and that's our focus. Our primary services really are structured around many of the elements. Of you that may be familiar with process safety in particular, there's 14 elements, and our primary services address mechanical integrity, relief systems, process hazard analysis, PHAs is the common kind of acronym for that, and a lot of process safety information. That's not only just the validation, but also a lot of the management of PSI. So who am I? Well, I was lucky enough to be a co-founder of Provenance in 2006 with two of my trusted friends and colleagues, Justin Adams and Tony Powell. I graduated from University of Texas at Austin, Hook 'em Horns. I have over 20 years of experience, and my 20 years has really been focused on process safety. I started out of college and went to work for an owner-operator, and then worked for an engineering firm, and then participated in the startup of Provenance back in 2006. But every portion of my career has been focused on process safety. Some of my particular interests in that realm are risk assessments, analysis of PHA data, and process safety information. I do want to thank Heather. She has done a lot of the development of the presentation, and a lot of the team in Provenance has also contributed to the contents of this. So I want to thank everyone that participated. And I also kind of like to share my perspective on webinars. I think webinars can fill lots of different purposes. Either they're educational, sometimes it's just kind of communal commiseration, sometimes it's just confirmation that you're thinking correctly about some particular issue. What I found is in a very chaotic time when things are unknown, it's helpful for me to be able to have someone to go to that just kind of forces me to pause and sit back and take a bigger picture look at what is going on. And that's really the purpose of today's webinar. Is over the past couple of months, we have been flooded with just a lot of changes and a lot of modifications. And what we want to do is really challenge the audience, the real experts of your facility. You are the expert in your facility. You are the expert of your own PSM program, and just kind of show you what our thoughts are and a mechanism to kind of hit the pause button, back up, and try to evaluate what all these changes have done specifically to your PSM program. So I hope we accomplish that, and I'm looking forward to questions at the end to clarify any points. I saw this cartoon the other day, and I really got a kick out of it. And as you can see, someone's in a meeting in some highfalutin office, and they're saying, oh, remote working is just years away. And then you've got this wrecking ball of COVID-19 headed their way. And you could replace remote working with a number of things, whether it be technological migration or reduced staffing or alternate. There's a lot of things that people thought, oh, well, someday we'll have to address that. Someday we will have to figure out how to handle that. And the world's changed. And COVID-19 really caused everyone to do things on a schedule and timeline that they didn't plan for. So one of the greatest teachers, if not, he was absolutely the greatest teacher that ever walked the face of the earth, always taught in parables. And so one of the things that I always try to do is just take that hint and start a presentation with an analogy. So that analogy I've kind of extended out, and it's the wrecking ball analogy of hitting a home, and then try to draw some parallels to what it might be doing in the industrial space. So if a wrecking ball hit our house, well, we have to keep living there. We can't necessarily just pick up and go somewhere else. And the analogy in the process operating world is really, we've just got to keep operating. It's essential that we keep going. The other is, when the wrecking ball hit, you probably have some walls that are no longer structurally adequate. So we've got to take some immediate steps. We have to do some immediate things. We've got to make sure that those leaning walls don't really fall in and cause further problems. In the industrial space, a lot of people had to quickly modify some important programs. They had to quickly assess, hey, what is the core programs that we need to shore up now that our world has changed, and how can we do that? You might want to block off a few unused rooms in your home that has now been kind of impacted by this huge wrecking ball. Well, the equivalent is, hey, what is really essential? What are we using? What components of our programs, of our processes are we using? What's not essential? And so let's start to cut back on all the non-essential projects or components of our facilities, similar to blocking off rooms that you don't want to use and you don't want to invest in to fix at this moment. You might want to choose to change your household population. You may say, wow, well, we're bad enough to where we don't want to put our kids at risk. Let's send them off to grandma's. Well, similar is, hey, we are under a lot of work from home orders. A lot of governmental entities have said, hey, we want you to really minimize, and a lot of companies have made the decision to minimize exposure to COVID by allowing people to work remotely. Kind of the last is we've got to make sure it's safe to live in. So you may not have the choice to leave your house. You have no choice to make sure it's safe. You have to make sure it's safe. And the equivalent is we've got to prioritize what's going on in the industrial space, and we've got to keep it up and running. We have to do it in a safe way. So in order to do that, we have to make some changes. The world around us has changed, and so that means we have to change as well. And it's kind of a silly cartoon, but it's nice nonetheless. So what do we have to do? We have to ensure that changes have not created unnecessary risk. So a lot of things have happened, and the people on this call are really the experts in your own space. And one of the things that I think I want to communicate is, you know your facilities, you know your programs better than anyone else. All I want to do in this presentation and this webinar is really help you come up with a structure to assess what risks may have been what have been created and may have entered into your processes that you just haven't had time to figure out yet. I just want to be that pause button that makes you think, okay, how do we go about this assessment? We know a lot of things have changed, but how do I make sure that they have not created unnecessary risk? And maybe even in this, we can create stronger, safer processes in all of this chaos. We will be making changes. One of the clients that I work with, she made a great observation, and it has stuck with me for the past 2 months. She said, there are certain things that we will never unlearn from this. There are things that we do not want to unlearn from this. And I thought that was just incredibly wise, that this will reveal to us maybe some structural defects of our house or our industrial processes that needed to be shored up long before. We'll realize that maybe our plumbing was so old in our house that, yeah, it didn't affect the sewer line, but it makes sense for us to replace that now because we're already making huge investments in the infrastructure. Well, what are some of those hidden things that now will become apparent in our industrial processes that we need to fix? So we don't want to change simply to change, but we have no choice. We have to change. We have to make some modifications. What's important is that we predict the impacts of not only the changes that have occurred to us, but the changes that we are making in light of this new world and how to do that. So it really brings to the forefront how do we make decisions? How do we estimate what these changes will do in a crisis situation? And luckily, I was reading an article in Barron's the other day, an interesting magazine that issues articles and reports on investments. And they had an article about how to overcome really paralysis when you're trying to analyze something. I'm sure everyone's heard of paralysis by analysis, where you just analyze everything to a great extent. And I think it's not only relevant for this entire situation of COVID, but specifically in our PSM programs, how do we begin to know when to make changes, what changes to make, what the schedule of those changes are, what the impacts of those are? Not only the changes that have occurred to us, but the changes we naturally have to make in this new environment. And there was two things that really stuck with me. One, the longer I wait, does it change the outcomes? So if I make a decision today versus 2 months from now, does it really change the outcome? And if the answer is yes, the earlier I make a decision, the more positive the outcome could be. Another way of saying it is the later I make a decision, the more negative the outcome could be. That should lead you to make steps earlier. Even though you may not make the perfect decision, it's better to make that decision earlier. I expect that many of the people on this call are engineers. And I think that stereotypes for engineers are pretty accurate. We love data. We love information, and we want all the information and all the data to make a decision. We want to inform ourselves. We want to have everything in line. We want to put it in a spreadsheet and a balance sheet, and we want to make sure we know exactly what's going to happen when we make that decision. The problem is when you're in a crisis situation, the time required to gather all that data now puts you a little bit late in making the decisions. And so we are in a crisis situation. I don't think anyone would argue with that. The changes that have made in the world, and specifically to our industrial processes, we're in crisis mode. And how do we make those decisions? Well, the best way to do it is to really do some mental time travel. Think ahead of what the end result could be, and that should help you drive the decisions that you're going to make. So if we think about this in the realm of PSM, there are a lot of unknowns. Unknowns is, what are all these changes going to do to our facility from a PSM perspective? So there's a big unknown of, and I would say the more important unknown of, have we put the process safety programs at risk? Have all the changes that have occurred to us put us at risk? That's the most important issue, and that's a big unknown. But just because it's a big unknown doesn't mean we should go and wait till we gather all the information in order for us to make some specific decisions and changes to ensure the operating safety of our facilities. A minor unknown is, will these changes, not only the ones that are occurring to us, but the ones that we have to make, how will it affect our compliance? Provenance has always advocated, as most of industry has, that you should focus on the process safety first. If you have the process safety lens and you make sure that your system and your processes remain safe, your compliance will come into order. If you focus on simply compliance, you'll probably be focused on the wrong items. However, I do want to give you a little bit of consolation. If you haven't seen, OSHA did release some information about a month ago that said that in the inspections that are going on, that OSHA recognizes the world's a little bit different than it was 2 months ago. And so when they are looking to issue citations, if an employer can demonstrate that they have performed some changes in good faith, that the inspectors do have a little bit of leniency in issuing citations. But the measure is really, they will take into strong consideration the attempts to comply in good faith. So for that small uncertainty of, hey, are we compliant? Thankfully, OSHA recognizes and formally came out and said, yeah, different world. And if we feel that you have not been in compliance, then we may kind of hold a citation, but that group of things that we find that aren't cited because we've paused those citations, they are going to come back and they're going to develop a program to look at all of those paused citations and determine whether, after things get back to normal, the owner-operators have taken care of those. So again, from the compliance, from the smaller blue box of the previous slide, it's always interesting to know, what does OSHA focus in on? And OSHA has had, over the past years, a national emphasis program specifically for process safety management. And the most frequently cited PSM elements in the past year, and I just took for the past few months through 2019, in order of quantity of citations issued, our mechanical integrity, it was the largest, the most frequently cited, and it had 4 sub items there. I'll let you read what those are. Then process safety information, hazard analysis, which is essentially the way that you analyze your risk in your facility, operating procedures, and management of change. So of the elements, of the 14 elements of PSM, these are the ones that are most cited. Again, OSHA has said, hey, there's certain things that we may allow people to have some lenience on. In this letter, they specifically referenced the PSM standard. There was 4 or 5 things they specifically referenced. The PSM standard was one of them. Even though there might be some leniency, this does give a good indication of where they will cite. In my opinion, these areas of citation also are the ones that impact the bigger brown uncertainty the most. And if you look at kind of the history of the industry and some catastrophic accidents, mechanical integrity, having good PSI, doing a well-performed PHA, making sure your operators know what they're doing, all of that are the high elements, the more important elements. So OSHA has actually, in my opinion, got their citations right if you just look at the quantity and kind of the prioritization. Those are the more critical elements that will impact that bigger brown area of uncertainty. So if you translate that into something that Provenance has historically done, we break down the 14 elements into PSM mindsets. And there's 5 mindsets: identify the hazards, communicate the hazards, protect against those hazards, reevaluate those hazards, and then be transparent about those. The 5 most frequently cited elements fall into one of each of the mindsets, with an exception to the transparency. So they don't really focus on one aspect. They really say, hey, all of these matter. And especially when you start to look at what each element does, they really kind of focus on some core components. So a well-rounded program is important. And I think that knowing that those citations are a risk area, an uncertainty, it's good to look at it through this lens. The next section is where we're going to talk about how to evaluate your decision making. How do you evaluate the situation? How do we know how to assess the uncertainty and make decisions in this crisis situation? Well, the first thing is we have to understand, well, what happened? And so there's a lot of things that have happened, a lot of things that could impact your process safety management programs. We broke it down into 2 broad categories. By no stretch of the imagination are the only two categories that really impact your process safety management programs, but they're the 2 that we thought were probably the most prevalent throughout industry and had the more long-lasting and far-reaching impacts to your PSM programs. So they fall into 2 big buckets: staffing changes and spending changes. So staffing changes, there's a number of things that have happened, and I'm sure every one of you is familiar with many of these. You have reduced on-site personnel. You've got to reduce people that are going to your facility. You want to try to reduce person-to-person exposure. You might have short and potentially even long-term staffing changes. You may have cut a number of contractors for some period of time, and maybe even potentially long-term. You have reduced or eliminated some of the on-site people, and that could also translate into remote for non-essential employees. So staffing changes, without a doubt, have occurred, and they occurred rapidly. So what we want to do is to start to understand, okay, those staffing changes, well, how does that impact our PSM program, and when do we make those decisions as to modify our PSM programs to account for these staffing changes? The same thing happened with spending changes. Some of the spending changes, we may be pushing out turnarounds. You may have canceled some capital projects. You have budget cuts. Your processes may have changed as well. You could have reduced rates. And again, what I want to do is I just want to hit a pause button. And I want everyone to kind of step back and say, okay, yes, we agree. All this is here. And I simply want to outline a structure of how you could evaluate what occurred to your PSM programs with these changes. So these aren't the only two categories. You as the expert in your facility could probably list others. We think these two are probably pretty ubiquitous and probably a good example of far-reaching impacts. So the next thing you have to do is you have to start to think about, well, what did that do? We need to continue our risk assessment, the risk assessment on our PSM program, by looking at the consequences. What are the consequences of the changes that we have made because of this crisis? So let's talk about the spending changes. Again, the actions that were taken, just a short list is there on the left that we just covered, but really can be summarized as, hey, where can we cut? That's the mentality right now. Where can we cut? Where can we cut expense? We want to operate skinny until this crisis is over and the market stabilizes. Some industries, oil and gas industry in particular, has an additional compound problem of, boy, the price of oil right now, not the best it's ever been. So you've got two huge crises at the same time. And so that's going to result in a lot of spending cuts. So when you see this, how does that translate? So from a PSM perspective, we want to just highlight some things, show you a process of how to make this evaluation, and hopefully give you some tangible examples to say, yeah, I think I should go look at it through that lens. Frequently, our clients kind of intermingle PSM corrections into larger projects. They will find something that they want to do from a hazard evaluation or an incident investigation or a mechanical integrity finding or a relief system evaluation, and they'll say, oh, we should go do something. We should add some basic process controls. We should increase the size of that relief device. We should replace that vessel because it has too much corrosion. Those elements are frequently wrote into larger projects. If that project gets delayed or even canceled, how do you know that those are going to get addressed? So that's a consequence of spending changes. You may lose some PSM corrections because they're intertwined with other projects. Additionally, PSM deadlines become a bit fuzzy for lots of reasons. One reason is because specifically deadlines was one of the areas that the letter of the OSHA letter kind of dealt with of, hey, we understand you might miss some deadlines. But furthermore, everyone's focus is on a lot of different things that they weren't on previously. A lot of deadlines from a PSM perspective are really internal to your own company. PSM is a performance standard, and you say when you're going to do things, how you're going to do them, and you're measured against what you say you're going to do. So all of those deadlines may be pushed or flexed, or maybe you don't even know that they're being missed because your attention is on so many things. So one thing you may want to do is, again, update your documents, your internal policies to simply show how you're going to document those move deadlines. One of the reasons I always advocate for you to do that is it simply forces you to think through it. Formalizing those policies kind of allows you to stop and think, what should we give a temporary pass to? A lot of the deadlines, PSM has just a litany of deadlines, and don't lose focus on that. So two of the things we'll cover more is don't allow your PSM elements to be lost in your larger projects. That's a consequence. They could be. And your PSM deadlines become a bit fuzzy. Additionally, there could be a backlog of PSM-related activities. Right now, you may be absolutely at the brink of chaos from a staffing perspective. People can't travel. People that historically came to your facility to do different tasks aren't there. So you're wondering, well, how am I going to reschedule things? A very specific example is, man, should we reschedule our PHAs? They actually specifically mention that, OSHA specifically mentions that in their letter. So you could choose to, hey, we don't have the right people. We've typically contracted facilitation. That facilitator may not be available. They can't travel. You may be pushing all of those out. Well, that is a consequence of that spending change. Strains to your budgets may lead to, hey, is this budget or a process safety kind of battle? Increased risk of loss of containment. If the people are really cutting back on cost, they may be trying to look at delaying maintenance. Great example, a turnaround being pushed out where they have a lot of maintenance planned. Well, when you do that, have you considered your end of life? Does that impact your end of life of equipment or the next inspection date? One small trinket there is reliability validation. For more sophisticated risk assessments, a lot of people look at the reliability, very calculated reliability based on testing frequency. So if you test it every 6 months, it then proves out to have a certain reliability. That reliability impacts the safety of your facility. If you're moving those out, how does that truly impact the expected reliability? Also, if you delay some maintenance, how does that impact the progression of damage to your equipment? Some other things, overlooked changes to operational impacts. So you may be changing your operational dynamics. Cutting rates is a great example. Rate reductions, changes in pressures and throughputs due to those changes in the process. They can and will have ripple effects on your equipment, such as damage mechanisms. And we'll talk about damage mechanisms specifically in a bit. Release system design. For example, when you start to cut rates, do you cut the cooling capacity on some of your equipment? So now a column system, or you have a heat imbalance, does that now have a different flavor of release system impact because you've cut your cooling capacity, but all of your release system assumes you have a certain amount of cooling if you had a high flow of steam on your reboiler? Do you look at those? How can you run down those scenarios? Because it will have an impact on the safety of your process. The next big category, those were all the spending changes. So kind of a list of staffing changes and what that may do to your PSM programs. So staffing changes, we're still trying to do the same things with a different staff perspective. The course is probably, let's stay the course. It's, hey, let's try to do everything that we were doing historically. We'll just do it with different staffing regimes. People may be remote. We may have less people. We'll reassign. We'll shuffle. So it's stay the course. Let's not make huge changes. But I think it's important for us to step back and say, yes, we want to stay the course, but changing by definition is not staying the course. So what are those impacts? One that I think gets a lot of attention normally, but is now elevated further, is normalization of deviation. You have a lot less people in your facility. And whether it was a formal program or not, that means you have a lot fewer eyes that are looking at your process. You don't have people that are unfamiliar with your process kind of going through. You don't have someone installing new pumps that have not been in your facility. You don't have someone that is providing a new training to your operations folks. The people that are there may be normalizing the deviation because they're around it every day. One of the great benefits of having some flux, some change, some new people into your facility on some regular frequency is you have fresh eyes, you have new observations, and those can be routed up. Most of our clients have such amazing emphasis on this. They emphasize to people, If you see something, report it. And now people will see it, but not realize it's a deviation. That normalization of deviation is a very concerning item. Additionally, PSI. I think process safety information is frequently overlooked in a normal PSM program, but now even more. And when I say overlooked, it's not given the attention, but I don't think everyone recognizes how often and frequently PSI is updated, validated, and used. So when I say it's overlooked, I don't mean it's not given the appropriate attention. I just don't think people recognize all the ways that it's updated and validated. So in your PHAs, you may need to know, hey, what is the relief device size? What is the orifice size? And you'll holler at someone to go verify. Or you have a team, you have some specific people that did that historically. You would tend to probably call someone that was really familiar with relief systems, and they would know what to look for. You may want to know some pump information, or maybe you're doing a mechanical integrity assessment and you want to know some operating conditions. Typically, gathering and validating that PSI was done by the experts that were involved with that evaluation. But now it may be deferred to just whoever happens to be on shift that day, and they may see it as a nuisance. So that short-term verification that could be now done incorrectly, not out of anything that is because of laziness or lack of interest, but simply because they are unfamiliar with data validation, that's going to leave a permanent shadow in all of your programs. So later on, you may come back and find it, or you may not, but you'll probably end up having to go back and revalidate some of that information. So some staffing changes is normalization of deviation. Some consequence, another consequence is this permanent shadow in your PSI. Staffing changes also will create some siloed work processes. Previously, when you could walk across the hall or down to another building and ask someone how they were evaluating a pre-startup safety review or their specific thoughts on an MOC, now that's being done remotely. You cannot discount the different dialogue that will occur from face-to-face to now remote. So you've got to recognize that you're kind of more siloed than you were previously. Also, the next is overlooked impact on IPLs and safeguards. A lot of our clients have very specific requirements for response time to alarms that you would identify in a PHA. Has the impact of all these staffing changes now impacted the operator's ability to respond? Do they have more of a burden doing a lot of other things? And so now the burden has changed. Is the response time still adequate? Has your staffing changes now been such that you're asking operators to work in areas that they previously weren't? But it's similar, we just don't have the right training in place. Are you being as mindful as you normally would? So those have some direct impacts. Your staffing changes will have impacts on your PSM program. So now the question is, okay, well, yeah, we had two broad categories that we brainstormed, staffing changes and spending cuts. We were able to identify some specific consequences of those. And I think most of you probably, if given enough time, would come up with lists very similar. But all we're advocating is you just need to take a pause and do that. And we've taken a pause and done that for a lot of our clients, and we're hoping this helps you. So identifying what has happened and then what those consequences are, well, that's great. But you have to start to figure out what actions am I going to take? So it's, hey, when do I take action, and have I gathered enough information? Do I really know whether delaying our PHA schedule is right or wrong? Well, how do I know that, and when do I take action? So we're going to talk about some things you can actually do to mitigate that risk. We broke it down into 5 categories. And this isn't comprehensive, but we think these 5 would probably be pretty good to look at the lens of correction. Document everything. And I think a lot of people will tend to say, oh, well, let's just document it so that we have something to give OSHA or our management or someone else if they come in and they want to check to see what we're doing. I have found personally, and I don't know if it translates to everyone, but I've found that if I sit down and actually write why I'm making the decision, it just becomes clear in my own head. And being able to communicate it to someone else, the rationale of why these changes were made and what their impacts are and how we're going to mitigate it, I think just adds clarity to your own thought. So it is incredibly helpful when you should have to answer or report to someone, either a regulatory body or some management entity. Documenting is key. Second, treat PSI as essential. We'll talk about why that is. Third, decouple PSM from the projects. Fourth, leverage your data, your PSM data smarter. Leverage it. You have a wealth of information that you used to rely on walking down the hall and talking to someone. Now you don't have that luxury. Fifth, specifically some risk-based inspection components. So mechanical integrity, as we mentioned earlier, is one of the more frequently cited. I would argue it's one of the more important elements to keep your facility safe. RBI has a lot of great tools. So let's go through each one of these. Document everything. That really is central to the good faith efforts that OSHA is looking for. Again, I think that's great. I think it's great for you to have something that you can hand over to OSHA, but I think it's more important just to force you to understand your own thoughts and put it on paper. It'll help you identify blind spots and deciding what those changes are and how they can be documented. You can also document your risk assessments for delaying the turnarounds and any of the inspections or PMs. So just document, hey, we've delayed this turnaround. That's going to delay our inspection. It's going to delay some preventive maintenance. Document why that is okay. The items that have kind of our provenance insignia there, these are ones that we think could be permanent. So as I mentioned earlier, one of our clients said there's certain things we're just not going to unlearn. We're going to remember from this chaos, and we're going to want to continue. So some of these we've highlighted that, hey, these might be something you continue or have already previously done that are now more important than ever. And I think this one is probably something you've always done, but now is more important than ever. And let's verify that you're training and understanding by your ops staff if you're shifting and shuffling your staff more to different facilities to cover for sickness, different facilities, different units, to make sure that you have those things documented, that your operators truly understand. Historically, you've probably done a great job of that, but are you really focused on that training and that awareness when you're shifting your people around? And kind of a sub-note there, do most facilities and the people in that facility, do they assume, possibly incorrectly, that the risk is just naturally lower when you have reduced rates? Because that's not necessarily the case. We talked earlier that lower rates may actually increase the risk. And how do you make sure that that is the case? So just awareness and re-education, kind of re-emphasis to your operators that don't get complacent simply because we're at 60% of rates. The risks may actually have changed and they could have actually increased. Treat PSI as essential. So some of these changes we think could be long-term and permanent changes. So we spoke of the problem, the consequence of every PSM program needs information. It needs that data. And that data now is gathered and validated by different people that historically weren't doing it. Well, do you have the availability to just identify one person and train them incredibly well and kind of designate them as a data manager? So a lot of people think, oh, that's just PSM. Well, that's really not it. PSM is responsible for the overarching umbrella programs, but is there someone that would be the go-to person for all kinds of data validation, whether that be a P&ID walkdown, confirmation of what pump is installed, confirmation of the metallurgy? And that is a very unique skill set that crosses a lot of boundaries, crosses a lot of programs. And that is a very interesting lens that some of our clients are taking of, you know what? We're scattering out all this validation among all these people. Maybe it makes sense to centralize that. It's something that has not been done historically, even though people think, oh, that must be PSM. No, that centralization of equipment and information validation has not been done. Not in the light that we're seeing now with this new crisis. You also need a budget for corrective action when you do return to normal. So all those projects that are getting to that are kind of getting impacted by inaccurate PSI, you need to make sure that you have budgeted items to do that. You need to find through PSI. If you treat your PSI as essential, you can use your existing systems to find these hidden risks. So when you have rate decreases, do your overpressure scenarios change? Meaning, are they larger than they once were? The things that we inherently took credit for on controlling the relief system rates, has that changed? Well, what I want to do is give you some specific things. I'm not a fan of webinars that you don't have a takeaway with. A takeaway, if you want to make sure, go to your relief system documentation and focus on abnormal heat inputs. I can promise you, if you are in an industrial setting, you probably have someone that's very aware and very familiar with your relief system's design, and you just need to say, hey, what abnormal heat inputs could be impacted because we've changed the regime that we're operating? Another specific, very tangible takeaway. Go look at loss of level scenarios in your hazard evaluation and your relief system documentation. Why is that? Well, previously you may look to say, oh, we run at certain levels, and now if that level is lost and it goes to a downstream vessel, well, we'll never overfill the downstream vessel. But what you didn't have to evaluate is gas blow-by. Well, now you could be operating at a lower level, and now a gas blow-by scenario could apply. So I would look at abnormal heat input. I would look at specifically low level or loss of level in PHA and relief system documentation. A third one, I would look to see if specifically your relief devices that were discharging the atmosphere retain the same dispersion at lower rates, lower throughputs. So you previously said, hey, this is safe. We expect that we won't have any type of environment that we would create when this relief device lifts that would be in a lower or a higher explosion limit. The dispersion's beautiful. It's great. Well, now has that changed because your rates have changed? That may be worth looking at. All of that is your PSI. It's your process safety information. It's the hidden gems in your process safety information you can use to find your hidden risks. There's many others. Those are three that our team brainstormed. The third thing to do, decouple your PSM activities. We think that it would be important to permanently change the way you manage your scopes. So review your scopes, look at everything that's been delayed, canceled, and then review the scope. Moving forward, extract all of the scope that was specific to PSM, because now maybe that would impact your operation, the safety of your operation, if you don't do it in a timely manner. So one, you can take those scopes, review the scopes of work, extract that, find out what components may have been hidden or included into larger projects that are now delayed, canceled, paused, and moving forward now, highlight them. Find a way that when that is done, when PSM elements and corrections are included in a larger scope, you have a way to do this easily. You may have that way now, you may not. But knowing that, hey, we thought we were going to have this installed and operational by October, and now it's going to be delayed till next October, that could be important. How do you do that? Now, if you extract all those out, how do you know which ones to focus in on? Simple. Risk rank them. Risk rank them to see whether the delay has increased your risk above your acceptable levels. So look at the scopes. Extract out the PSM elements, list them all, risk rank them, and go after the high risks first. Leverage data in smarter ways. So you've got a lot of information. We talked about PSI. We talked about using that PSI and making sure it kept current. Identifying someone that is your focused data integrity manager. Some of that was an overlap of this, of how to use your data in smarter ways. But when you have a robust PSM program, I've been lucky enough to implement lots of PSM programs with our clients, and one of the things that most clients put together is a PSM ownership document. So they specify who owns what elements. Well, review that and say, how has the staffing changed the ownership or the implementation or the execution of that? This document was probably generated and put on a shelf. Now's the time to get it out. Get it out. Who owns these elements and has the staffing changes impacted it? Use all of your information to answer questions like, hey, what equipment are really important safeguards for your most serious consequences? So if you're delaying maintenance, which ones do you just absolutely not want to delay maintenance on? Well, just look at your PHA. Which ones used for the highest risk scenarios? Which ones were used the most frequently? The fact of the matter is we are going to have to change. Things may have to slide. We have to be realistic about things can't stay status quo. It's all about how do you use your data to make the best decisions. There's uncertainty. How can we remove the uncertainty, make the decisions now? Use that information, see what ones were used for the highest risk, which ones were used the most frequently, and then prioritize that maintenance and inspection. Another thing is a lot of people are now doing remote PHAs. There's been a lot of presentations, a lot of discussion on remote PHAs. They talk about the how to do it. One thing that I'm curious about is everyone engaged in these? So does it make sense to make slight modifications to your PHA process just so people think, oh, we're doing it a slightly different way? I better really hone in and focus on what we're doing. This also allows you, if you categorize your hazards, if you say, oh, we have 10 refineries or 15 specific chemical facilities, and they're all doing the same thing, you can say, hey, we've got the same risk spread across many different facilities. If you categorize your information, you can say, hey, how did the plant in Tennessee do that? I'm sitting down here in Texas, and I know I've got a similar plant in Tennessee. How did they evaluate it? So it allows you for a much quicker and faster risk analysis, because frankly, if you set in on a PHA, most people don't like them. I love them. I think they're amazing. I would wish everyone would find as much joy and pleasure in PHAs as I do, but they don't. And so it's more important to be realistic and find quicker, faster ways to analyze it. You can use the information from all your facilities. Fourth, use RBI Program Components. If you are delaying preventive maintenance and inspection schedules, RBI, risk-based inspection, has a lot of amazing tools that you can bring to bear. Delaying those mechanical integrity checks need to be performed really from a risk management perspective. Just kind of a small note, a lot of the standards, API standards specifically, allow you to look at out of service time and add that back into your scheduled inspection due dates. So that's kind of nice. If you do have equipment that you're taking out of service or pausing and they're out of service, you may be able to beneficially extend a lot of inspections. That's just a nice little reminder. You need to understand the reliability impacts before you delay those mechanical integrity efforts. So if you are delaying them, use RBI to find an alternate inspection frequencies. That was one of the primary focuses of the generation of the risk-based inspection planning years ago, to allow you to extend these out in a very safe and calculated manner. And then evaluate those process changes with an RBI lens to ensure that new damage mechanisms, new damage regimes have not been created. A lot of damage regimes occur within certain flow rates or certain temperature thresholds. Great example, corrosion under insulation. If you hit a certain temperature threshold for the process and associated wall temperature of the piping, you don't have to necessarily worry about corrosion under insulation. In this new operating regime, do you now have different temperatures? So have you created some hazards that you previously didn't know about? RBI is a wealth of information, of ways to identify those new risks. So if you put all this on one screen, what's interesting is it looks like a PHA. If you've been in a PHA, you have causes, you have consequences, and you have safeguards. And if you start to look at that, you can see, hey, a lot of these safeguards are similar. So I just wanted to put this up here because I think it's a very accepted and familiar methodology in the industry for people to analyze risk. And it's nice that if you can show and present information in a manner that already resonates with management. So evaluating what has happened with staffing changes and spending changes, put it in a format that resonates with people, probably helps get things accomplished. Okay, so to wrap up, it's important to predict the risk. What has all these changes done? How do we extrapolate that out? We're suggesting using a cause, consequence, and protective analysis methodology. How quickly you decide and make this evaluation does matter. If you wait to say, oh, well, preventive maintenance, yeah, we'll delay, but we're not sure what the impacts are, by the time that you make all those delays, you may be too late. You may not know what the delay did to you. So you've got to start to predict. Do not allow yourself to find yourself in the paralysis by analysis situation. Think beyond PSM compliance. Use the previous history of OSHA citations to focus your efforts, because they do cite some commonly overlooked and very important elements. And then, as you're putting in these different programs and modifying your programs, consider what should be temporary and what may be permanent. Okay, I appreciate everyone's participation, and we have about 5-6 minutes and want to open it up for questions. So Heather, I think you're going to feed me the questions.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Patrick. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, wonderful. So we've got our first question here. Says, we have joined the trend of conducting remote PHAs out of necessity. It wasn't something we really did before. However, we are struggling to provide the reference material to the teams in a streamlined way. We have a lot of references and sources that are only hard copy. What would you recommend to help us make source material available to dispersed workers more easily?
Yeah, so I think I break that down into 2 categories. One is PSI, so you have to have PNIDs, you have to have pump information. There's just a lot of information. Most mature PSM programs have that, right? And they have it on some SharePoint or some documentation source. That's one area. I think the industry has typically got that conquered. So I'm going to assume they're not asking about that. I'm going to assume that they're asking about how to get to their PHA information, the cause, consequence, the actual evaluation, and being able to see what was done. Frequently, PHAs are documented in a manner and reported in a manner that you deliver this huge binder or a very specific data file that people can access. There are commercially available softwares that allow you to kind of import all your PHA information and provide that over the web. So there are solutions to that, to be able to access your PHA information. And hopefully, if you're in a more sophisticated PSM program, all of the PNIDs and pump curves, that's all electronic. If it's not, if you're struggling with either one of those categories, we don't have our PSI electronic, how do we view our PHA information? If you're struggling with either one of those, I think that one of the things we recommend of kind of having a data integrity manager helps with that. They can help feed the information to the PHA, both from a PSI perspective and also information from previous PHAs.
Wonderful. Along the PHA line, we have a question here that says, as a facilitator, do you think future PHAs after the COVID crisis will be conducted more frequently as a remote PHA, or is the inherent value of having everyone in the same room going to stay the same? What do you predict there?
I think we're going to see a mix of both, whereas previously we saw pretty much in-person pretty much across the board. I would say that 5% of PHAs were done remotely and 95% were done in person. I think we're going to see that shift. I think the in-person ones will remain, but I bet we start to see a much different ratio. So I would expect that we'll see more of a 70-30, 70% in-person, 30% remote. Maybe the less critical, the shorter PHAs can be held remotely, that is less of a disruption to people's schedule. The longer and more complex processes are done in person to make sure that the evaluation and that team is fully engaged. So I think there will be absolutely a shift. My opinion is that shift is going to be based on the evaluation quality and the necessity to have a higher quality and more engaged team.
On an interesting but different note, how do you suggest handling motivation and human behavior in ways that it affects process safety? So how do you keep teams motivated in ways that keeps process safety top of mind while still maintaining the correct safety distances during shift handovers, for example? But keeping process safety top of mind while handling different motivations right now.
Right. Well, I think that is going to be a problem. Everyone has a many other things. Not only are you an operator, but now you are also a second grade teacher because you are now handling the education of your students and of your children. So you've got so many other things weighing on you. I think it is management's responsibility and frankly PSM's responsibility to keep that at the forefront. The way I would recommend, the way we keep it at the forefront from a personnel safety is we have toolbox talks. Hey, slip, trips, and falls. I don't think PSM has ever latched on to that. I think we should. It is about awareness and it is about ensuring that everyone keeps that in the forefront of their head. A lot of things that prevent slips, trips, falls types of accidents, personnel safety, work exceptionally well if we start doing that in PSM. We just haven't had that need. Well, this crisis has created that need. We may want to have kind of a dual purpose of both personnel safety and process safety to keep it in the front of everyone's thoughts.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I wish we could finish going through all these questions. We really appreciate all of the feedback. And if you have any other ones, please feel free to continue sending them on. But it looks like we have come to the end of our time slot here. We will be addressing all remaining questions that you send in via personal email. If you have a question come up after we end, please email us at the address you see on the screen, sales@provpsm.com. Once the recording and final set of slides with added Q&A slides are available, we'll email that out to each one of you. We do appreciate your time today and would be happy to discuss any process safety issues that you're dealing with in this new pandemic work environment. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much, Patrick, for all this fantastic advice. Stay safe and stay healthy, everyone, and have a great day. Thank you very much.